Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. The Ukraine conflict continues to rage. Jim, some people are looking at it and speculating that the day of the main battle tank is over. What do you think?
Well, the problem is the Russian tanks are different in ways that are not advantageous for the Russians. The other problem is when they sent their armor units in general into Ukraine, they didn't follow the doctrine of having the tanks gain information via infantry or air support or what have you, so that they could protect themselves against ambush. The Ukrainians had figured that out, and they basically were able to ambush the Russians before they even knew that they were in danger. Now, the Russian tanks, the T-70, the T-72B, the one they favor over their T-90, like all modern Russian tanks, has an autoloader. And the problem with the autoloader is it has a lot of live ammunition in the turret, whereas the M1, the American M1, does not have an ammo loader. It has a system where the gunner, the loader, the human loader, gets one round at a time from the ammunition bus, which is the rear part of the turret, and uses it. Now, if the tank is hit, it's unlikely that one round is going to be caught, as it were, vulnerable. And if there is an explosion, in the ammo bus, the explosion will be vented backwards. It's designed that way. And in other words, the M1 has protection against the kinds of attacks that destroy Russian tanks. In fact, it's quite common if you look at the pictures of Russian tanks destroyed in the last, few years, you'll notice that most of them, the turret is blown off. Now, why should the turret be blown off? Because there's a lot of ammunition in there ready to cook off the instant there's enough heat in the turret to detonate, something explosive. So the Russians were extremely vulnerable. Their tanks were supposed to have, they have explosive reactive armor. The latest T-72s have thicker armor, but they are still vulnerable to top attack. They've tried to do that with reactive armor, but it hasn't worked against the NLAW, which is a short-range javelin, as it were, or the Javelin, both of which can employ top attack. And these were basically successful against the Russians. Devastating, their tank force and their armor in general. The Russians apparently know this, but they have no quick solution other than to give the latest. They finally appointed one general to run the whole thing, and he's the guy who basically bought into what Assad was doing in driving all the pro-rebel Sunni Arabs out of the country, most of them anyway. Permanently changing the ethnic mix of Syria. The problem in Ukraine is the entire country. Well, there's a small proportion of the population that would prefer, union with Russia, but the Quisling faction is very small. So the Russians are faced with a nation in arms, and they really, don't have any way to deal with this. And plus, the Ukrainians keep coming up with new ways to embarrass the Russians. The latest one being the sinking of their flagship in the Black Sea, the Slava class destroyer Moskva, which 2 years ago underwent an extensive refurbishment to update it. But the Ukrainians figured out a way to bypass the anti-missile defenses and tagged it with two of their Neptune. That's an improved Russian Kh-35, Harpunsky, as we called it in our coverage and strategy page. And that was enough to get a fire going. And then it hit the magazines, it hit the live ammunition, and boom, the Moskva was, dead in the water. and then it was lost as the Russians tried to tow it back to the port of Crimea, their naval port, and it foundered, went under, and now they're trying to come up with excuses. Their latest excuse was it was actually a fire that started, and the 500-man crew, with all their damage control training, couldn't deal with it, and they had to abandon ship. Now that's embarrassing enough, but they consider it less embarrassing than admitting that the Ukrainians. Austin, your turn.
Austin, what are your impressions of what's been happening with the armored forces there in Ukraine?
Well, Jim touched on a design difference. At this point, given the way Western tanks are armored and built, it's a design flaw. It would be fair to call it a design flaw. And the T-72 series, I'm not sure how the Armada, which is what they're calling that, the T-14, Jim said it. Yeah. I'm not sure what its turret layout is like.
It's an unmanned turret.
I'm sorry? It's
an unmanned turret.
Yeah, it's
still
unmanned.
Obviously using an autoloader.
Sure.
But the crew, two-man crew, are in an armored capsule, and they are less vulnerable to being blown up. But that doesn't stop the tank from going up.
That's right. One other comment on a two-man crew. It's hard maintaining a vehicle with just 4 men, as on American tanks. You can do it with 3. With 2, you're going to need maintenance assistance if you drop a track or on anything, and plus security assistance. That may sound technical, but it's not, because you can get stuck in Ukrainian and Russian mud very, 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 very quickly. Now, get back. Jim talked about the technical and technological differences, and I've seen a demonstration of how that blowback on the Abrams system works, and that is how we built it, both for vehicle survivability, crew safety, crew survivability, and the Russians did not. But Russia has given the world a look at both tactical and operational misuse of armor, which is surprised me. That's something that comes out of this war, about how chronically inept they have been, their officers have been. And it's reflected in poor training of the troops, the individual vehicle crews, but the employment is it's inept. I'm going to talk about France, late 1940, Battle of the Bulge. Now, just for a second, Dan, it's not new that infantry has to be with the tanks. And Jim knows a heck of a lot about Combat Command R, 4th Armored Division. That was, forget the colonel's name that 4th Armored had nominally in charge, but the 2 star battalions that often ended up together in Combat Command R were Creighton Abrams, 37th Tank Battalion, and George Jox's Armored Infantry Battalion. I forget the number. I ought to know it. Both of those guys, Abrams tank, but both those guys were absolutely elite armor mobile leaders. And they basically just mixed their companies. They fought with what they called Team A, which was a company of the tank battalion and a company of the Armored Infantry Battalion. And when they could line them up, it would be like 1 half-track to 1 tank. They're same thing for their B team, same thing for their C team. And they would tell the company commanders, "You guys are making those together, but you know what your objective is. You've got mission orders." But right there, you see the acknowledgement that tanks' power is enhanced when it works in conjunction, in this case, with armored infantry. Now, take a look at Desert Storm. There you saw the display of, and when I've written about it, I call it the ballet, the mechanized ballet that the U.S. Army had been seeking to perfect, going to Fort Irwin constantly. And what do you have? Tanks mixed with Bradleys. Second Armored Cav had its Scout Bradleys, smaller detachments on that. And the Armored Cav is small combined arms outfits themselves. But that's the way they would be tasked or organized. You might have a few pure tank companies leading, not just but when you actually go into combat and you go into the offense, everybody's deployed, and the infantry on their Bradleys. It's scratching fire is what it's called, either with machine guns or with the 25 millimeter, keeping down enemy infantry, and also watching for targets for the tanks. And if you run into a situation where there's the infantry deploys out of the Brad, you're fighting combined arms. Now, I've just gone through the ground. The way the American Armor Brigade works when it's in the offensive, it's got its flanks covered by attack helicopters. It's also got attack helicopters and drones over it. Above that, you've got the Air Force or Navy, not only clearing the skies, but if you've got A-10s, then you've got a gift from God, because you've got fabulous close air support. Tanks don't have to do the killing. What everybody's looking to kill then is enemy aircraft and surface to air missiles. And to put this together as well, I'll go back to Jacques and Abrams. Both of their battalions had, in a headquarters company, 381 millimeter mortars on a armored half-track carrier. A lot of the time, they just created one super 81 millimeter mortar platoon with 6 tubes. They both had complete control over it, and when whatever team was making a main attack, they would be they'd get that they'd get those 2 combined mortar platoons. That was their own artillery. Now, another thing I didn't say but Combat Command R all had, I'm forgetting the number of it. It had armored self-propelled 105 battalion that at least in the Ardennes counteroffensive basically just followed Abrams and Jacques' armored advance. You support this in organization as it's moving with both long-range fires, either from either missiles, MLRS, or the aircraft, but also with mobile howitzers and the mobile mortars, and where we use 120s now in the battalion platoon, but we still have plenty of 81s. You use that both to provide smoke, obscure when the smoke is useful, but also for suppressive fire and for isolating enemy pockets of resistance, so you can keep moving. Now, I think Jim's going to come back and say, Austin, you've described Fort Irwin or France. Actually, I could be describing Ukraine during the summer. And the problem that the Russians had is that Well, there are a lot of problems, but you get strung out on a road like that, you are you are not able to deploy. And I've only seen, oh, Dan, I don't know how many short videos I've seen, probably without exaggeration. It's somewhere probably between 80 and 100. I've only seen 3 where I actually saw Russian infantry after an ambush deploying to support the tanks and to attempt to suppress, engage, capture, kill the Ukrainian ambushers. Even though there is a real terrain difference, the Ukrainians have been doing to the Russians something akin to what the Finns did during the Winter War, where they kill a vehicle at the end of the column, then kill one at the front, and then the thing is, in the Arctic swamps, now they are stopped. But here the Russian troops that are stalled, here they start trying to go around the vehicle in front or back up, and they don't take aggressive action against the ambushers. And what you do is supposed to do is swing your turret and just start blasting when you know where they are. Okay, maybe that's out of all these videos I've seen, they were taken by Ukrainians who took off afterwards, and you don't see the Russians finally doing that. I've thought that, but I have seen absolute, at the officer level, failure to coordinate the use of the weapons the Russians have. Now let's get to the other thing is their use of attack helicopters. Man, they've really got what is the Russians do close to air supremacy, at least in terms of air to air. The fact that, and we've talked about this before, the fact that they haven't knocked out all the Ukrainian mid-range SAMs amazes me, but they haven't. So there are places that it's risky for the Russians to fly. But Jim may know more about this. I have yet to read of a strike in Ukraine that has more than 6 or 7 or 8 Russian high performance aircraft in it. Well, on the way the U.S. and NATO runs an air tasking order, we may have 60 or 70 fast movers engaging in a range of strikes to destroy, isolate, destroy enemy, isolate enemy strong points that just soften up the area before the armor and mech forces move in. They haven't coordinated something that they should have every advantage with. They've ended up doing the one thing that we have since World War II, World War I, we know Russians can do, which is just fire a lot of artillery at a city and level it. So anyway, the tank's not dead. The tank is, we've seen it in Ukraine, employed by the Russians, has been misused, and it's almost, I know this is taking it to an extreme, but it's almost like each vehicle is fighting in isolation, and you're going to lose. You're going to lose. You're going to lose a lot. Maybe you can afford to take endless casualties, and that's certainly the way Putin's trying to portray it in Russia. But there are a lot of Russian officers that need to be fired, and somebody's been lying to somebody. That's evident. In an earlier strategy talk, Jim talked about maintenance and logistics. I did a little bit as well. We're seeing signs of just poorly maintained armored vehicles. I don't know if they got them out of stocks or if this is the way that they use them, but that's that's also a failure in leadership. Maintain your vehicles. Check the tires. if you've got a truck, get new tires, and so you don't break down. It's really been inept, Dan. I think I've covered it though about how you can win with tanks, and I'll make one other point. We're moving back to a more static war, and the Russians are going to be battling in the east, dug in positions there that have been more or less static since the Russian invasion of Ukraine into the Donbass in 2014, after they'd taken Crimea. Ukraine, if it's going to win, is going to have to be able to conduct an offensive operation. And that's why they need tanks. I'm glad the Slovaks have given them some. I think the Czechs have. I've read that a couple of other NATO nations, unnamed, were providing them with former Warsaw Pact equipment, some of it modified, some of it apparently not. They need them. They also need airplanes. They need the MiG. Why they don't have the MiG-29s now? I read what the White House says. They know how to use them. And matter of fact, I read an interview with a Ukrainian pilot who said that, the U.S. says it will take months for us to learn how to fly what he called the F series, meaning F-16, F-18. He says, I don't know. He says, I think some of us can figure out how to use one in a couple of days, maybe a few hours, because it's not all that different. I'll end it there.
Jim, what do you think the Ukrainians need next in their efforts?
Well, they need more vehicles, more armored vehicles. I agree with Austin. They're going to have to launch an offensive, a ground offensive against the Russians in Donbass. Also, if they want to take back Crimea, it'll be the same thing, except they'll be attacking on a small front. Now, as Austin pointed out, the Ukrainians are very innovative, they're very entrepreneurial, and they're very motivated, something you can't say about the Russians. Now, something to remember about the Russians, one of their key problems, the reason why, so many officers are killed and not doing their jobs, is because the Russians have not, despite many efforts, years, over a decade of really trying, been able to create a career NCO corps, as it were. This, they recognized after the Cold War ended, was one of the keys to Western military success. For example, a career NCO will make sure that the motor maintenance or motor stables, I don't know if they still call it that, it was one of the most unpleasant jobs for the troops to perform. If they just had officers, junior officers, riding herd on that, they'd find a way to get out of it. But with veteran NCOs, you don't. They have bitter experience about what happens if your vehicles are not maintained. And we sure as heck got in there every week or every year, a couple times a week, depending on the time of year. I was in an artillery battalion, but we had a lot of vehicles, soft skin vehicles. And we climbed under the damn, we had the checklist of things to check on the vehicles. We tuned them up during the winter time. I'll never forget pulling guard duty once. Korean winters are bitter, like northern, New England and northern New York, where I grew up. And we had to go out there. I forget what the schedule was, every couple of hours, and start all those vehicles, turn them over, because if not, key elements, oil, what have you, would freeze up. And come the dawn, and you had to move out. A lot of those vehicles wouldn't move. So you were on basically a vehicle warm-up duty overnight. That's why the guard duty section for the wintertime was larger, because some of the guys had to run out there and basically turn on a certain number of vehicles throughout the night just to keep them from freezing over. Now, the Russians don't have those NCOs, career NCOs. They have some of them, but basically nobody wants to join the Russian army. We did a piece on this. About how the reason why the conscription is only for 1 year was because after the Cold War ended, the Russians, since they could now vote, and basically protest more openly, they said, we want to end conscription. Now, the Russian government, even Putin, agreed that it'd be a great idea. He realized the value of an all-volunteer force. And as long as you're mixing volunteers with conscripts, you're really, limiting yourself. Because the main thing is, without an efficient force, people don't want to stay in and become career NCOs. They have to deal with so many problems that remain, like the 1-year conscripts. If they're going to do anything, useful, indeed, that may be one of the reasons for the loss of the Moskva, battle cruiser, destroyer, 12,000-ton ship. A lot of those sailors are 1-year conscripts. It takes them most of that 1 year to basically learn, key sailor skills like damage control. We still spend a lot of time on damage control, and we basically saved a couple of ships that were badly hit for one reason or another. In one case, in 2000, in Yemen, the bomb, the suicide boat bomb, which tore a hole in the ship, the destroyer. Our guys knew how to do it. In fact, since then, we've invented computer simulations, first man shooter, so to speak, where you can basically practice going into extremely dangerous situations. And if you are virtually killed, you learn a lesson. All right, you don't do that if you got this kind of situation. And the sailors, the American sailors, Western sailors in general, take damage control training very seriously. Russian sailors often don't get it, or if they get it, they don't get enough of it. Obviously, the Russians thought they could justify losing the Moskva by saying the crew was unable to be able to fire. Now that's bull hockey, as the saying goes, because if there were a fire, no matter how vulnerable the spot was where it broke out, if you have effective damage control teams, you're going to put that fire out. And of course, it's worse when they have to explain that they got hit by 2 Neptune missiles. Now, what they did do the next day was they bombed Kiev. There were explosions, and at first nobody was sure, what the missiles were attacking, because that's the only weapon they have, and they haven't got many of them left, because they basically used up their war reserve. And it turned out that they were aimed at the factory that produces the new missiles, new anti-ship missiles. Now, Zelensky apparently foresaw that, and he's been asking the West, send me some harpoons. Now, they're not as good as the Neptune. The Neptune is apparently, it's basically a much improved Russian KH-35 anti-ship missile. It's got better countermeasures, and apparently it could get past Russian ship defenses, even if their countermeasures, their version of phalanx and what have you, were operating. But in this case, they used a couple of their Turkish, UAVs to distract the crew, and that basically is seen as the reason why the 2 missiles hit the Moskva. Now, those missiles are not designed to destroy a ship that large with one hit, but 2 missiles started a fire which the Russian crews, could not control, and they basically had to pull the crew out. And then, of course, Admiral Weather did the rest. As it was under tow, it got hit with a storm, and a towed ship is not a controlled ship, and down she went. So the Russians may never know exactly why they lost the Moskva, but maybe they don't want to know, because that's not the first disaster. They had the Kursk, the submarine, a brand new submarine, operating underwater in a naval exercise in 2000, and boom, boom. The sonars, picked up a small explosion followed by a much larger explosion. Well, they finally brought up most of the Kursk, and they were able to examine why this new submarine with all sorts of new features, went down. Well, the first explosion was apparently a torpedo, which, when loaded into a tube, was damaged. And that caused the to explode in the tube. That detonated several other torpedoes in the torpedo room, and that was the second explosion the sonar heard. And then the design features of the Kursk turned out to be, how should I put it, defectively implemented. And the underwater protection, failed. The compartmentalization failed, and the Kursk went down. There was one compartment where about I think 28 sailors survived, but they also didn't have the Western ship, crew recovery equipment, which I think Britain had the closest one, and they volunteered to airlift it in, put it on a Russian ship, and go out there and save it. They refused, and they lost it. They lost the surviving crew members. Now, since then, the Russians have basically implemented that sort of thing, often buying Western equipment to equip their crew recovery, submarine crew recovery, ships. But they didn't have it when they needed it, and now they've lost the Moskva. So their submarines are defective. There's the Moskva, which 2 years ago underwent a several years of refurbishment to update it. Well, it didn't update it enough. And the one thing they can update is having veteran sailors, especially chief petty officers, the equivalent of first sergeants and senior sergeants in the ground forces. They can't get enough of those, and they're at a perpetual disadvantage. And that's why we pointed out they haven't got a second echelon. They apparently offer rewards for people who would, sign up. They have a special deal where while conscripts can't go into a combat zone, even though by their standards Ukraine isn't a combat zone, it is an internal matter. A lot of these contracts, the reservists they called up, could basically sign on for a 6-month or 12-month contract where they'd be paid more, and in addition they were offered large rewards if they could destroy Ukrainian vehicles or aircraft or whatever, and nobody took it. They said no. I mean, Ukraine is a death trap for Russians, and so they're having a hard time getting additional troops. In fact, at one point the Ukrainians discovered they basically sent down the staff and cadets of a military school. Now, these guys are teenagers, and what teenager in training wouldn't jump at the opportunity to test themselves in combat? Well, they failed the test. Well, actually, they passed the test, but they died doing it. And so the Russians are really out of options. They're basically attacking civilians, but they have to get close enough to use artillery because they really have a limited supply of missiles left. They can't replace a lot of those missiles because a lot of them, like their version of the American cruise missile, the Caliber, it does rely on some Western components, which were promptly cut off by the sanctions that the super sanctions they'd ever expected to be inflicted on them. Now the Russians can convert some of their factories to producing some of these components. They've had to do that before when they invaded Ukraine and in 2014. There were a lot of Russian aircraft and weapons which were dependent upon components coming from Ukraine. Well, suddenly they couldn't get those. The most important one were the turbine engines for ships, and it took them about 3 or 4 years to basically produce a second-rate version of the Turbosik. That's the primary Ukrainian manufacturer of these engines, a substitute, and they're basically still suffering shortages. Now this is 8 years later. So the Russians have basically put themselves in a very bad situation, and there's no easy way out. But Putin doesn't want to, how should I put it, quit. If he loses Donbass, that's bad. But if he loses Crimea, he's basically lost his reputation. They've lost thousands. They admit now to over 6,000 dead. The Ukrainians keep better track of it. They think it's up to 17,000, 18,000 dead, which is more than they lost in 8 years in Afghanistan. And we lost 2,000 in even 20 years in Afghanistan. So you can see, and the Russians are aware of these statistics. Now, a lot of Russians have been fed nothing but state propaganda for the last 5 or 6 years. The first thing Putin went after was state control of mass media. So most Russians outside the cities don't have internet, what have you, don't have alternate sources of information. They're believing a lot of the lies that Putin is feeding them. But as more of their sons, and these are the kids who tend to at least try being a contract, a volunteer soldier, are not coming back, and they're not getting answers from the from the Russian government. Now, people who have access to the internet in Russia, even though it's censored and it's difficult to get information in, people in the cities are getting it, and they're finding the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian military, on their website is posting pictures of dead Russian soldiers that they can't identify, and just as a service, as it were, to the next of kin in Russia. And a lot of the parents are finding out, oh, there's where Ivan, what happened. He hasn't written. He's dead. So that increases the anger, but that's a slow boil because, like I say, a lot of Russians are effectively cut off from this information that the Ukrainians are making available. But you can't hide a dead body, as the saying goes. And this was a problem during the Afghanistan, the 8 years they spent in Afghanistan. As the bodies kept coming back, they were unheard of in the Soviet days. There were demonstrations. There were people basically making, how are you going to deal with, mothers, as it were, demanding an end to this war that was killing their sons for what? And now they've got it on an even larger scale in Ukraine, and there's no end to it. The longer they stay there fighting the Ukrainians, they're dealing with the nation in arms. Now, a ground offensive, even in Donbass or Crimea, you're dealing with Ukrainians who know the terrain. They know the people. There are a lot now. Most of the people in the civilians in the half of those two provinces that Russia was able to grab before they were stopped by a unexpectedly rapid, mobilization of Ukrainian forces. Many of them have left, either gone to Russia. They were given Russian passports, and they're technically they had an election, a sham election, which declared their independence, but they were not annexed by Russia, which Russia didn't. A similar situation down in Georgia in 2008. And a lot of the others found their way into Ukraine by one way or another. And so you haven't got many civilians left there. And if the fighting intensifies, they're gone. So the Russians are basically on their own against Ukrainians who are fighting for the country. What are the Russians fighting for? Fighting for, their leader. And as they're finding out, that only gets you killed.
Well, Jim, part of the propaganda pitch, and I know you and I both pound on this, but we're fighting for Mother Russia, but greater Mother Russia, returning to superpower status. We'll be a great power when we return all the lost provinces to the fold, even though Putin's got himself in a bind with his propaganda that Ukraine doesn't exist. And he goes around and talks about how Russia and Ukrainian history are entwined and the like. Look, one comment about isolation of the Russian people. Cell phones. The Russians have got a lot of cell phones. That's even in the outback. That's it, in the little villages. Now, they can be cut off. They can be monitored, but that is a porous means of transmitting a voice message and also video and still imagery. And I read one article maybe a month ago about Ukrainians knowing Russians and trying to contact them in Russia, tell them what's going on. So I don't, it made sense to me. Maybe they were trying to call, friends and tell them, we're all right, whatever. But that's also a way of reaching the Russian people. It breaks through they're not absolutely isolated, much to Putin's chagrin.
Well, what they did there, what made that newsworthy, that story, was the Ukrainians were capturing a lot of Russians.
Right.
And if the guy was willing to give his phone number, they give him a cell phone. He could call up, tell him, "Mom, Dad, I'm okay. I'm alive. I got captured, and I'm calling from Russia." In some cases, the Ukrainians would make the call first and say, "Your son is okay. Here he is." And if it was a video call, they'd show the picture, and then they hand the phone over to the kid, and he'd explain to his folks what happened. Now that gets around by word of mouth, as it were, even if the Russians.
We read the same thing, but it was also said that Ukrainian civilians calling and the like. But you're right about that. Using that technique. Here, call home, tell them you're okay, you're captured. But which is a heck of a message that bursts the bubble. One other thing on what to call the Moscow, because it's 12,000 tons, isn't that? It's
yeah.
I really think it ought to be, because I think it was that size the Russians called a cruiser during the Cold War, a rocket cruiser, a missile cruiser. But oddly enough, just yesterday, I got a phone call from a friend who asked me about that attack on the Moscow, and I told her, and she actually says, "Well, it's a destroyer," and I said, it's around 12,000 tons, but these terms have changed greatly from what you see in a World War II movie, because Arleigh Burke's the latest flight, they're almost 10,000 tons. I mean, and they're the size of World War II cruisers. But anyway, I think that's. I'm not going to argue over the designation on it. The fact is that those Neptunes worked. However, the Ukrainians deked or jinked the ship's defenses. More power to them. And they got. I think your analysis, Jim, is about probably what happened when those missiles hit. That the Russians don't know how to do damage control is dead on. But I don't know how many media sources will go into that detail and understand that that's a war-winning Navy does battle damage, damage control and succeeds at it. So.
Well, even during the Soviet period, the normal conscription was, I think, 3 years. Eventually went down to 2 and 3. But if you wanted to join the Navy, which was seen as a more comfortable assignment, you had to tack on an extra year, because it took that long to train sailors to basically do things like damage control or simply operate weapons. Another problem with Russian warships in general, surface warships, they packed a lot of weapons into a relatively small ship. And what that meant was, and we confirmed this after the Cold War ended, we were able to examine a lot of these ships more closely and talk to Russian officers and sailors, was that they did not have the capacity to repair problems at sea. American ships are large and they have larger crews, partially because they have self-repair capabilities on board. They have parts, they have machinists, machine shops, and what have you. They couldn't put that on a lot of the Russian ships. So if something broke down, and a lot of things did, you basically had the ship disabled. It was a common news item during the Cold War. You'd see a Russian warship being towed back to port because something broke down that made it a mobility casualty. And even after that, after the Cold War, whenever the Russians went on a long-range tour, as it were, say to Venezuela or whatever, they would take along a supply ship, which could basically do second duty as a tow if something happened. I think that only happened in maybe one case. But the Russians are still aware of the problems they had during the Cold War. The problem is they haven't been able to solve them. In fact, they realize what the basic problems are. They dismissed a lot of officers in the first round of reforms because they basically had, even though the Russian military lost 80% of its manpower after the Cold War ended. They didn't basically eliminate a lot of the officer positions. So you had a lot of officers who were basically responsible for units that no longer existed. And that took a fight. And they got rid of those. But they still have a lot of officers, mainly because, as you pointed out, the officers served the role of NCOs at the lowest level, at the platoon and the company level. And these guys are second lieutenants. And, in America, they say, nothing more dangerous than a second lieutenant with a map or doing anything else. That's why you have a platoon sergeant. And one thing they teach officers, even at West Point, is pay attention to your platoon sergeant. And you had, basically older officers telling you this, and they tell a few anecdotes and what have you. And the Americans would learn. But the Russians were never able to implement that. And so you're seeing the after effects of that being played out in Ukraine. Now, another thing, I think this article hasn't run yet, about how all the the Russian, the intelligence agency and those of the CIA and several of the major countries in the West did not accurately predict what would happen if there was an invasion. We overestimated the Russian capabilities, even the Russians did, and Putin has since fired several hundred of his intelligence personnel, and we underestimated the willingness of the Ukrainians to fight. Now we knew that was not the case. We were sending in weapons ever since 2014. We were sending in training teams, advisory teams, and what have you. These guys would get back and say, these Ukrainians are not going to be pushovers. They basically, after 2014, they formed a territorial army. Now, they never got as many volunteers as they wanted, but the territorial battalions, there was, 100 and some of them, they did have enough people and weapons and uniforms to accept a lot of volunteers and to train them, quickly to operate a tank weapon or, your AK-47, what have you. And this worked. Suddenly they had lots of volunteers, more than they could handle. And once these volunteers realized how effective they could be, and most of them came back and were able to tell the others, well, this is how we did it. And the Russians haven't got a clue. Well, now the Russians do have a clue, but there's not much they can do about it, because they found out that they couldn't rebuild. They basically lost about half of the battalion task groups. That's the type of organization they've adopted over the last decade or so. Actually, they used it as early as World War II, but they never were able to overcome the resistance from the generals who wanted divisions and corps and what have you. And they basically pointed out, well, the Germans were very successful with the smaller battle group organization. We finally reformed our divisions into German type divisions in the Road Division, and then later, 20, 30 years later, we started developing the Combat Brigade, which was a mini division, and this proved very effective. Well, the Russians went one step further and had these battalion task groups, but they didn't have the officers or the trained personnel to make them work. And they found that out the hard way. And indeed, the Ukrainians claimed that they destroyed about a third of them and rendered another, third, not fit for combat. In other words, they'd taken so many losses, they no longer had any unit integrity. And when they got these back to Russia, which is what they did recently in northern Ukraine, they pulled all their BTGs and other forces out. They found out they didn't have the people to rebuild them, and so, like I say, it's quite a fix.
Well, one comment on the BTGs, they look a lot like what during the Cold War the Russians called an operational maneuver group for a division,
or a road operating detachment.
Right, but it was those would be that would be a slightly smaller tactical group, because when I was in the 11th Cav, we were supposed to ambush the hell out of those guys. But the OMG was very good troops from the division, or maybe even drawn from a couple of divisions that was task organized as kind of a super battalion with maybe a couple of tank companies, a couple of mech companies, and its own artillery, and they're supposed to run around, go around strong points, and push deep. And I think the BTG was now a late 20th century, early 21st century attempt to resurrect that concept. But these guys have not trained, Jim. I know you know that. They haven't trained in combined arms tactics, and that is what it takes in an offense. So I'm going to make a little bit of a projection here, Dan, about what we're going to see down out of the Donbass. The Russians have figured out that they can't do the mechanized ballet, so they're going to line tanks up on narrow frontages. It'll be tough to ambush them, and they'll have infantry behind. And they're not going to do the one thing they have successfully done, if you call it a success, hub-to-hub artillery, not smart weapons, hub-to-hub artillery, and just try to smash everything, scorched earth, bombs or whatever, right in front of this heavily armored fist, and then lurch forward. And they're just going to keep lurching because that's something they can control. That said, lined up in the way I'm suggesting you line these tanks up, terrain always is not compliant. They're going to have to break down in odd areas. And the drones, Ukrainian drones, and some of their smart systems, and they've been extremely effective using rockets. Jim, the one I saw suggested to me that it might be a rocket with submunitions in it, the kind comes down on top and at least get your mobility kill on a vehicle. The operation with using the tactics I outlined, it can also be stopped with kind of a frontal assault, dreadful losses, but it overcomes the deficiencies that they demonstrated with their battalion task groups. I'm curious if they, I said it's a projection. They are going, if you look at the Battle of Mariupol, which I understand the Ukrainian Marines surrendered yesterday because they ran out of ammunition. In an odd way, that's the way they fought that. The Russians fought that. The other thing is Putin now has a victory because he's connected Crimea to Russia through quote unquote Russian controlled territory, which is why I say that Ukraine's got to be able to launch an offensive and retake something. But we shall see.
Yeah, we shall see. We'll be here.
The other thing the Russians have to avoid is using all artillery and scorched earth. They'll create what the Romans described as a desert and call it peace.
That's right.
Right. That's exactly the whole purpose of annexing Ukraine.
Yeah, but there's another phrase I've heard about, the awful mathematics of the Tsar, and Stalin did. In other words, putting people in graveyards. That's same thing. Yeah.
Well, we hope the violence is over in 2 weeks, but I'm pretty sure we'll still be talking about this 2 weeks from now. We'll see you then, gentlemen.
Bye, guys.